You've probably used this white powder to remove bad smells and thought it didn't work. Maybe in your shoes, maybe in your fridge, and after waiting, nothing really changed. So you assumed it's just one of those home tricks that sound useful, but don't actually do much. But here's the strange part. It was working, just not in a way you could notice. Because the same powder, in one setup can remove odor almost completely, and in another, feel completely useless. Same product, same amount, completely different outcome. And the reason behind that is something almost nobody notices. But once you see it, you start realizing why it failed before, because this isn't about luck, and it's not about the product either. It's about something much simpler and much easier to miss. It's about how it interacts with the air around it. Now here's the part most people get wrong. Smell isn't just bad air. What you're actually smelling are tiny invisible molecules floating around you, from food, from bacteria, from sweat and from moisture. And once they're in the air, they don't just disappear, they linger. That's why that smell in your shoes, or that weird fridge odor, keeps coming back. Most people try to fix this by spraying something, but that doesn't remove the smell, it just hides it. The original molecules are still there, waiting. So after a while, the smell comes back again, and that's the frustrating part. It feels like nothing really works. But that's not true. Because if you actually want to remove odor, you need something that interacts with those molecules directly. Not cover them, not mask them, but change them. And that's where this powder comes in. Because this isn't just any powder, it's baking soda. And the way it actually works is not what most people think, and this is where most people get it completely wrong. Because the common belief is simple. Baking soda works like a sponge. It absorbs smells, sounds logical. But here's the problem. If that were true, it would behave the same way everywhere. But it doesn't. And that's the first clue something deeper is happening. Because people do the same thing again and again. They open a box, place it in a room, leave it for days, and expect the smell to disappear. But it doesn't. And after that, they usually stop trusting it. Here's the part nobody thinks about. It's not failing. It's just barely interacting, and that changes everything, because now the real question becomes, why does it work extremely well in some situations and feel like it does nothing in others? Now here's where things get interesting. This is not a cleaning trick. It's a chemical interaction. Most bad smells don't come from random air. They come from specific molecules that are slightly acidic or chemically reactive, and baking soda is mildly alkaline. Now I know that sounds like school chemistry, but this one detail is exactly why it works. Because instead of trapping odor, it reacts with those molecules and neutralizes them, not hiding them, not covering them, changing them. Which means the smell doesn't just disappear, it gets broken down at a chemical level. And this is why, in small closed spaces like a fridge, a container, or inside shoes, it works surprisingly well. Because there, the air is limited, the odor is concentrated, and the powder actually gets enough contact to do its job. But now here's where everything shifts. Because the moment you change the environment, the result completely changes. Now imagine this for a second. You take a spoon of baking soda and place it in a large open room, and you expect it to control the entire smell in that space. But here's what actually happens. In an open environment, air is constantly moving. New odor molecules are coming in, old ones are spreading out, and that small amount of powder is only touching a tiny fraction of it. So yes, it is technically working, but the effect is so small. Your brain registers it as nothing is happening, and that's the mistake. Because people assume, if I can't notice it, it's not working. But that's not true. It is working, just not in a way that scales. Think about this. If you drop a spoon of sugar into a river, it dissolves instantly. But does it change the river? Not even slightly. That's exactly what's happening here. Same principle, different scale. And this is where most people get misled. They think, Let me just use a bit more. But that's not the real issue. Because this doesn't depend on quantity. It depends on interaction. And interaction depends on three things: how much air actually touches it, how close it is to the source, and how much surface is exposed. Miss even one, and the result drops instantly. That's why placing a single open box in a room almost always feels useless. Not because it doesn't work, but because the conditions don't allow it to work properly. And this is the moment people realize something important. It was never a product problem. It was a setup problem. Same powder, different environment, completely different result. And once you see that, you stop blaming the method and start questioning the conditions. Because that's where the real difference is made. So if the powder isn't the issue, then the real question becomes, what actually makes it work properly? And the answer is surprisingly simple. But most people do it wrong. So if the powder isn't the problem, what actually makes it work? This is where small changes make a huge difference. Most people use it in the simplest way possible. Open the box and leave it sitting there. But that's exactly why it fails. Because for this to work properly, you don't need more powder. You need more contact with the air. Instead of keeping it inside a box, spread it out into a thin layer. Now suddenly, you've increased the surface area massively. And that means more air molecules are actually interacting with it. And that alone can completely change the result. But that's only one part. The second factor is placement. Because odor doesn't spread evenly. It builds up at the source. Inside shoes, near trash. Inside closed cabinets, around moisture. So if you place it somewhere random, it's already working at a disadvantage. It needs to be exactly where the smell is coming from, not where it's easy to put. And then there's the third factor: time. This isn't instant. Even when everything is set up correctly, it still takes time for enough interaction to happen. But here's where most people fail. They expect immediate results, and when nothing changes quickly, they assume it doesn't work. But in reality, the process just hasn't had enough time to complete. Because once you combine all three, surface area, placement, and time, the result becomes noticeable. Not suddenly, but consistently. And that's the key difference. This isn't a quick trick, it's a simple system. And when that system is used correctly, it behaves completely differently from what most people experience. So when you step back and look at it, this was never about baking soda. It was about how anything interacts with its environment. Smell isn't something you cover. It's something you either remove at the source or neutralize through proper contact. And baking soda only works now when it actually gets that contact. That's why in small closed spaces, it feels powerful. And in large open spaces, it feels useless. Same material, same amount, different setup, completely different outcome. So next time you see this simple white powder, don't just place it and hope for results. Use it with intention, because when it's used correctly, it doesn't just hide the smell, it actually reduces it. And once you understand that, you don't just use it differently, you start thinking differently, and that's the real takeaway most people miss.